September 7th, 2010. A Chinese fishing boat is sailing through a disputed stretch of the East China Sea when it suddenly collides with two Japanese Coast Guard vessels. The captain gets arrested. Within days, Japanese factories start quietly running out of a material most people have never heard of. Within weeks, prices on global markets explode by 10 times in a single year. And within months, the entire Western world realizes it has sleepwalked into one of the most dangerous supply chain traps in modern history. The material wasn't oil, it wasn't uranium, it was rare earth elements, a group of obscure metallic elements with names most people can't pronounce: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, praseodymium, 17 elements that the world barely knew existed until the day it realized everything depended on them. And here's the thing about that fishing boat incident in 2010. That was just the warning shot. What China has done in 2025 to date makes that look like a minor disagreement between neighbors. Here's what nobody tells you when they talk about the US-China trade war. Most people think it's about tariffs on electronics and soybeans. It's not. Underneath all of it, there's a deeper game. One that started decades before the headlines, one that involves a group of minerals so critical that without them, you can't make a modern fighter jet, build an electric vehicle, or put a smartphone in your pocket. The question driving this whole story is this: how did one country end up controlling 90% of the refining for materials that power the modern world? And what happens to the rest of us now that Beijing has decided to use that control as a weapon? To understand this, we need to go back much further than 2010. We need to go back to a dirt road in the California desert in 1949, and a group of prospectors who accidentally stumbled onto something they didn't realize would reshape global power 7 decades later. The Mojave Desert. 1949. 3 men are out in the California heat with Geiger counters hunting for uranium. The Cold War has just started, and uranium is the hottest material on the planet. They get a reading near a cluster of mountains called the Clark Mountain Range. But when they dig, what they find isn't uranium. It's a mineral called bastnasite ore, packed dense with something far stranger. Rare earth elements. They don't know what to make of it. Nobody does, really. Rare earths are a group of 17 metallic elements that sit in a peculiar corner of the periodic table. Chemically, they're almost identical to each other, which makes separating them difficult and expensive. Their names sound like a chemistry professor's nightmare: lanthanum, cerium, europium, gadolinium, erbium, ytterbium. At the time, the world had almost no commercial use for them. But that changes fast. The Molybdenum Corporation of America buys up the mining claims, and by 1952, they are producing small quantities. Then something clicks. Europium, it turns out, produces an extraordinarily vivid red color when used in television phosphors. In the 1960s, color TV exploded in popularity. Every set needs europium for its red pixel, and the only commercial source of europium in the world is this one patch of California desert, a place called Mountain Pass. It becomes, almost overnight, one of the most strategically important mining operations on the planet. For decades, Mountain Pass has supplied majority of the world's rare earths. The United States is the undisputed global king of this market. Then something shifts, not overnight, slowly, almost invisible. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, China is making a decision that almost no Western policymaker notices or cares about. Beijing is pouring state money into rare earth mining in Inner Mongolia and southern China. Massive subsidies, regulations that are, to put it charitably, extremely relaxed, wages a fraction of what American workers earn, and crucially, a willingness to accept environmental damage that would shut any Western operation down cold. Chinese miners developed expertise in extracting heavy rare earths from ion adsorption clays, a source barely understood in the West. Meanwhile, the Mountain Pass mine in California starts leaking radioactive wastewater. Hundreds of thousands of gallons seep into the desert floor over more than a decade before regulators take full action. Fines, lawsuits, cleanups. The cost of operating under proper environmental standards makes American rare earth production economically uncompetitive against the Chinese price. By 2002, Mountain Pass shuts down completely. Here's the financial logic that drove that decision, and it matters to understand everything that follows. American manufacturers could either pay a premium for rare earths produced under strict environmental regulations, or they could buy cheaper material from China with no questions asked. The environmental damage happening in China's mining regions didn't show up on any balance sheet in Michigan or Stuttgart or Tokyo. The harm was real. It just happened somewhere out of sight. So, market by market, mine by mine, the Western rare earth industry quietly died. Not because China had better geology, not because their technology was more advanced, because they were willing to externalize costs onto their own land and communities in a way no Western democracy would permit. A man named Deng Xiaoping, one of China's most consequential modern leaders, had telegraphed exactly what was coming back in 1992. He said, plain and direct, the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. At the time, most Western analysts heard that as a comment about natural resources. Looking back now, it reads more like a strategic blueprint. By the early 2000s, China controls roughly 95% of global rare earth production. But here's the part that's even more important than the mining numbers. Mining is actually the easy part of this equation. Rare earth elements are notoriously difficult to separate from each other. They have almost identical chemical properties, which means pulling them apart requires a sophisticated industrial process called solvent extraction. It involves thousands of carefully timed chemical reactions, repeated across massive processing facilities, fine-tuned over years of trial and error. It takes decades of industrial knowledge to master. Between 1950 and 2018, Chinese institutions filed over 25,000 rare earth patents. The United States filed around 10,000 over the same period. China didn't just win the mining game, they won the chemistry game. They built the intellectual infrastructure of this industry so completely that by the time anyone in the West woke up, there was nothing to rebuild it quickly with. Today, China controls somewhere between 60 and 70% of global rare earth mining. But that number understates the problem. Their control of processing and refining sites at around 90 to 92% globally. And for certain critical, heavy, rare earths, specifically the elements like dysprosium and terbium that make high-performance magnets function in extreme heat, the concentration approaches 100%. The industrial heart of this operation sits in Baotou, Inner Mongolia, where massive processing facilities transform raw ore into refined rare earth compounds. For permanent magnet manufacturing, the component that actually goes into your electric car motor, your wind turbine, your military drone, China's share has grown from around 50% 2 decades ago to 94% today. Think about what that number means in practice. If you want to build a wind turbine anywhere on Earth, you almost certainly need a magnet made in China. If you want to manufacture an electric vehicle motor in Germany or South Korea or Ohio, the magnet driving that motor almost certainly passed through a Chinese facility. The supply chain isn't just concentrated. It's a single point of failure for the entire global technology economy. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who thought this was just an academic supply chain concern. September 2010. That Chinese fishing captain gets arrested near the disputed Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. China considers these islands sovereign territory. Japan has been administering them since World War II. The diplomatic situation escalates fast, and then, almost without announcement, Japanese companies importing rare earths from China start reporting that their shipments aren't arriving. Chinese customs officials were halting rare earth exports. Shipments that had been cleared were suddenly frozen at ports. All 31 Japanese companies surveyed by the government at the time confirmed they were encountering export obstacles. Japan imported about 90% of its rare earths from China in 2009. Its auto industry depends on rare earth magnets for hybrid vehicle motors. Its electronics sector needs them at every level of production. The response from global markets was immediate. Prices spike 10 times within a year. Companies start outbidding each other for whatever supply remains outside China. Inventory gets hoarded. Production timelines get disrupted. The global rare earth price explosion hits not just Japan, but manufacturers across Europe and the United States. The freeze lasts roughly 2 months before the situation partially normalizes, but the damage to perceptions is permanent. In boardrooms and in defense ministries from Washington to Brussels, the same question is suddenly unavoidable. What happens if China decides to do this again, except for longer, against more targets, with less warning? Japan's response to 2010 is one of the more instructive chapters in this whole story, because it shows both what's possible and what remains extraordinarily difficult. Tokyo assembles a response package worth 100 billion yen, roughly 1.2 billion US dollars, within weeks of the incident. The speed is remarkable. They invest in diversifying mines overseas, including a $250 million long-term supply deal with Australia, Lynas Rare Earths in 2011. They fund technology programs to reduce rare earth usage in motors. They build recycling infrastructure to recover materials from end-of-life electronics. They stockpile inventory as a buffer against future disruptions. JOGMEC, Japan's State Energy and Metals Corporation, coordinates much of this strategic response. Over the following decade, Japan reduces its reliance on Chinese rare earths from 90% down to roughly 60 to 70%. That is a genuine achievement by any measure. But look at what it still means. After a decade of dedicated national effort and over $1 billion in strategic investment, Japan still sources 60 to 70% of its rare earths from the country that already cut it off once. The 2014 WTO ruling that found China's export restrictions violated trade rules provided some regulatory framework, but didn't fundamentally alter the supply dynamics. That's how structurally deep this dependency runs. And Japan had 15 years of warning before they started addressing it seriously. The United States had the same warnings, and mostly looked the other way. Fast forward to April 4th, 2025. The Trump administration imposes sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods. China responds 4 days later with restrictions on exports of 7 heavy rare earth elements, requiring special government licenses for all shipments. The elements affected include samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium. These are not random choices. These are precisely the rare earths used in the most critical military and industrial applications. High-performance magnets, missile guidance systems, jet engine components. To give you a sense of the physical scale involved, each F-35 fighter jet contains approximately 900 pounds of rare earth materials. A single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer requires around 5,200 pounds. A Virginia-class submarine uses approximately 9,200 pounds. And the U.S. was getting around 70% of its rare earth imports from China in the years leading up to this. Then it escalates further. By October 2025, China expands the restrictions, adding 5 more rare earth elements to the controlled list. Holmium, erbium, thulium, europium, ytterbium. Now 12 of the 17 rare earth elements are under Chinese export controls. Beijing also announces that any product containing even trace amounts of Chinese processed rare earths, down to 0.1% of value, requires Chinese government approval to export anywhere. That rule, if fully enforced, would effectively reach into manufacturing supply chains across Europe, North America, and Asia that have ever used Chinese rare earth inputs at any stage. It's not just supply leverage, it's an assertion of extraterritorial regulatory authority over global industrial production. First of its kind, and nobody had a plan for it. The real-world consequences don't take long to show up. Ford's Chicago assembly plant halts production for several weeks in mid-2025 due to a shortage of rare earth magnets. Automotive companies in the United States, Japan, South Korea, Germany, and India start warning publicly about potential production cuts. Defense contractors quietly escalate concerns about component availability. By mid-2025, according to one analysis, only about 25% of export license applications from Chinese rare earth suppliers are being processed and approved. A trade truce is negotiated in May 2025, but it produces more confusion than clarity. American officials claim China agreed to lift the restrictions as part of the deal. Beijing doesn't publicly confirm this. Licenses continue to move slowly. Manufacturers caught in between are left paying premium prices for whatever non-Chinese supply exists, stretching inventories thin, redesigning components where they can. Jeremy Siegel, a professor of finance at Wharton, said it plainly on CNBC in the middle of all this. It's scandalous that we don't have a rare earths strategic reserve, that we let China monopolize 90% of the refining of rare earth materials. Where were we? It's the right question. The honest answer is that we were maximizing short-term efficiency. We were following the market logic that says, let whoever can produce it cheapest produce it. We exported the environmental costs to China while importing the benefits. We told ourselves that global supply chains were too interconnected to be weaponized. And the bill just arrived. Here's the financial dimension of this, because serious capital is now moving on the back of everything we just covered. Australia's Lynas Rare Earths holds the largest rare earth mining operation outside China. Their Mount Weld deposit in Western Australia is world-class. In 2025, under CEO Amanda Lacaz's leadership, their processing facility in Malaysia became the first outside China to separate dysprosium and terbium oxide at commercial scale. Not yet at a scale that replaces China's output, but it's real production, not a PowerPoint. MP Materials, operator of Mountain Pass in California, is the only active rare earth mining and processing facility in the United States. They've been investing in processing their own material domestically, rather than shipping raw concentrate to China, which is what was actually happening as recently as a few years ago. They're completing a magnet manufacturing facility in Fort Worth, Texas. By end of 2025, they'll be producing around 1,000 tons of neodymium iron boron magnets annually. China produces 138,000 tons. But the direction matters. The Pentagon has committed over $439 million since 2020 toward building a domestic rare earth supply chain. The stated goal from the 2024 National Defense Industrial Strategy is a complete mine-to-magnet supply chain that meets U.S. defense needs by 2027. The gap between that aspiration and current reality is enormous, but the political and financial will to close it is now genuine in a way it wasn't 5 years ago, and the demand trajectory is compelling. Global demand for rare earths is expected to grow by a factor of 7 by 2040, driven by the acceleration of EV adoption, wind energy expansion, and AI infrastructure build-out. More electric motors, more wind turbines, more data centers, more defense platforms, all of them running on rare earth magnets. The market is structurally growing regardless of geopolitics. Projects are now in active development in Canada, Brazil, Greenland, Tanzania, and South Africa. The economics that once made these uncompetitive against Chinese pricing have shifted. Strategic necessity now justifies costs that pure market logic never would. But pull back for a moment and look at the larger pattern, because rare earths are not the whole story. Rare earths are one piece of a deliberate multi-year strategy that China has been executing across critical materials. In 2023, they restricted graphite exports, the material that goes into lithium-ion battery anodes. In 2024, they restricted gallium and germanium, key inputs for semiconductor manufacturing. Then antimony, used in munitions and flame retardants, and now the rare earths. For each of these materials, the playbook is identical. Become the dominant producer, become the dominant refiner, let global supply chains grow dependent, then apply restrictions at moments of geopolitical tension as leverage. Not always full shutoffs, sometimes just slowdowns, license delays, bureaucratic uncertainty, enough friction to remind every trading partner what it would feel like if Beijing decided to turn the valve off completely. The IEA recently published a finding that's worth sitting with. For 19 out of 20 strategically important minerals globally, China is the leading refiner, with an average market share of 70%. And this concentration has been getting more pronounced over recent years, not less. This creates a form of asymmetric leverage that is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore at the negotiating table. When the U.S. restricts China's access to advanced semiconductor chips, China faces real technology constraints. When China restricts rare earth exports, American fighter jets, electric vehicles, and the components inside every consumer device face production shortfalls within months. These are not equivalent forms of leverage, and every policymaker in Washington and Brussels knows it. The story of rare earths is, when you trace it all the way back, a story about who controls the invisible architecture of modern production. The things that actually determine economic leverage aren't always the things people are talking about. They're buried in chemical separation facilities and processing patents, filed in languages most Western executives never read, and decades of industrial knowledge built up quietly while everyone else was focused on something else. We built the global technology economy on a foundation of materials that we assumed would always be available because the price was right and the supply was there. We made that assumption because it was convenient, and nobody who was directly harmed in the short term had the political power to change it. The Mountain Pass mine sat dormant for 15 years, not because the ore ran out, but because the market said it wasn't worth running. The engineers who mastered American rare earth chemistry retired, the institutional knowledge dispersed, the facilities rusted, and when the need came back urgently, there was nothing to rebuild quickly from. Now the rebuilding is underway, and it will happen, but it will take longer than any government wants to admit. The best expert projections say the West will still depend on China for 91% of its heavy rare earth needs in 2030. That's down from 99% today. But it means at least another decade of structural vulnerability. Every wind turbine, every electric motor, every next-generation fighter jet, every smartphone vibrating in your pocket right now, they all carry a piece of this story inside them. A tiny magnet, a trace of refined mineral that traveled through a supply chain where, for the foreseeable future, one government still holds most of the cards. This was not just a trade dispute. It was a demonstration of what it looks like when economic leverage becomes geopolitical power. And we are still living inside the consequences of it. If this kind of analysis into supply chains, geopolitical leverage, and the hidden financial architecture of modern conflict is something you want more of, if deep dive research into where war, finance, and economic power intersect is useful to you, subscribing to the channel will help keep this work going. Don't forget to like the video and share. Click the next video for another deep analysis. Thanks for watching.